Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for listening, downloading, and subscribing to the latest edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I'm 12 Kyle. Check this out. On this podcast, we're going to take a look back at 2019 and ask what was in your ears. The podcast edition. I'm going to tell you about some of my favorite podcasts from 2019. I'll also tell you about some of the podcasts that I quote unquote discovered this year. And I'll also tell you about some of the specific episodes of the 12 Kyle podcast where we had contributors and what we talked about. So without further ado, let's get the podcast jumping. Now, it goes without saying that I've been doing podcasts for a while. And what I try to do is not just do podcasts, but I listen to a variety of different types of podcasts. And I'm going to tell you about some of the ones that I listen to on a week-to-week basis. First, I'll start with some of the bigger podcasts, the staples, if you will. And these are in no particular order. Probably one of my favorite podcasts that comes out each week is QLS, the Questlove Supreme podcast. Love Questlove, Supreme Questlove, of course. The drummer for The Roots, the house band for the Jimmy Fallon Show. For those of you lames out there, he's the guy with the afro. But yeah, man, QLS, man, one of my favorite podcasts is Questlove and Friends. And they actually went through a change this year because I think somewhere around August, they had podcasts weekly. And right around August, because it was their podcast was being displayed or featured, I should say, weekly on Pandora, but it moved from Pandora to now iHeartRadio, but it's streaming on all platforms. Pandora was, sometimes could be hit or miss, but I think this is a good look for them. But it's a funny podcast. It's a musical podcast. They talk about, a lot of music type things, and the artists that are interviewed generally are musical artists, but it not necessarily have to be. It could be comedians. It could be a little bit of people from all walks of life. But and I said this on last year's podcast because it made my list, but if you're a music nerd like myself, you'll enjoy this podcast. Questlove Supreme comes out every Wednesday. So again, it's being featured on iHeartRadio, but it's streaming on all platforms. So it's on your Spotify, your iTunes, so forth and so on. So, QLS, dope podcast. I think you'll enjoy it. Another pretty popular podcast that I listen to, weekly, is the Joe Budden podcast. The Joe Budden podcast is, huge, man. Shout out to Joe. Many of you know Joe Budden from his days as a rapper, but he is now a, multimedia mogul, if you will. Joe Budden podcast they actually drop 2 episodes each week, every Wednesday and every Saturday. And of course, Joe Budden hosts this podcast with his friends Maul, Rory, and Parks. This podcast is really taking off, man. I mean, they have a deal with Spotify, and that's where it can be heard exclusively. They also show is videotaped, and the videotape makes it to YouTube as well. So if you want to catch the visuals, you can watch YouTube. If you want to just hear the audio, you can listen on Spotify. But man, I love it, man. This podcast is it really reminds me of me and my boys just sitting around, just talking trash and just having fun. They talk music, but they talk more pop culture than anything else. Sometimes they'll break down albums, pretty popular albums, if you will. But it's a dope podcast. Joe Budden podcast, normally running time is between 2 and 3 hours. I forgot to tell you, QLS, that's about an hour and a half. So those are really, really good listens. Another huge podcast that I listen to on a week to week basis, is The Right Time with Bomani Jones. I go way back with Bomani. He kind of feels like a friend to me, even though I've never met him. But Bomani, The Right Time with Bomani Jones is a sports podcast. Now, he does his sports podcast every Tuesday and Thursday. And that running time is about an hour. Strictly sports. He will throw some pop culture in there as well, but great listen. Bomani also has his own personal podcast where he talks about pop culture. That's called The Evening Jones. The Evening Jones, he'll do that probably every other Wednesday. I guess it just depends on his schedule. He's pretty consistent with it, but it's like every other Wednesday. Man, shout out to Bo, man, doing his thing. And of course, if you're familiar with Bomani Jones, you know that he has his own TV show called High Noon, which is on ESPN weekdays at 4 p.m. So yeah, that's another one that I checked out. One podcast that actually premiered this year is another sports podcast that I really have taken a liking to, is All the Smoke with former NBA players Matt Barnes and Steven Jackson. It's hosted, I guess the sponsor is Showtime, and you can either listen to the audio on I think it's on Spotify. I know it's on iTunes, as well as All the Smoke their videos are on YouTube. But two former players, and they talk, about the NBA. Normally they'll interview people. They've interviewed everybody from Kobe to Allen Iverson to they've interviewed quite a few former players and current players as well. Man, I love All the Smoke. I'm really surprised because I didn't know. I mean, I'd seen Steven Jackson do TV, so I knew he'd be pretty decent. But I did not know Matt Barnes was as good as he is. He's a very good interview and actually getting better and better as the season has gone on. But they're really fun. They don't really crack a lot of jokes, but it's very informational. If you're a fan of basketball, if you're a basketball head like myself, you'll enjoy this podcast as well. Another huge podcast that I listen to is called The Rhoden Fellows with Bill Rhoden. The Rhoden Fellows is a podcast about HBCUs. The Rhoden Fellows are 4 undergrad students who are from HBCUs, historically black colleges and universities, under the under the leadership of Bill Rhoden, the famed sports writer and columnist. I enjoy this podcast because obviously it's about HBCUs and they talk about pop culture as well, but being able to see, the development of these fellows, if you will. And of course, HBCUs are near and dear to me because I am the product of an HBCU, South Carolina State University. That's a dope podcast that comes out, I think, every Thursday or Friday. And it's about an hour as well. Now let's move on to some of the podcasts that I quote unquote discovered in 2019. The first podcast that I discovered, and again, these are in no particular order, was one that actually I think it came out in 2018, but I just happened to stumble upon it this year. It's a podcast called Dissect. In this podcast, the author, and I don't even have his name, what he does is he breaks down a particular album, right? And not only does he break down the album, but he breaks down each song on the album. So every song will get a segment. And what he did was he picked, I think it was a couple of my favorite albums. One of the albums that he broke down was The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill by Lauryn Hill. He also dissected To Pimp a Butterfly by Kendrick Lamar, Good Kid, Mad City by Kendrick Lamar. And when I tell you this thing is phenomenal, it's an incredible podcast. Each podcast lasts about 35, 40 minutes, but just imagine you listen to the Kendrick Lamar album To Pimp a Butterfly, and he takes one song and he breaks down the lyrics of one song for 40 minutes. It is incredible. It is one of the best podcasts that I heard in 2019, hands down. Dissect is available on Apple as well as Spotify. If you have not had a chance to check it out, please do. Again, for music nerds like myself, it is right up my alley, to be honest. And And not only does he break down that album, but he did a breakdown for Tyler the Creator's album, Kanye West's My Twisted Dark Fantasy album, and I think he did one other one, Frank Ocean's album, as well as Damn by Kendrick Lamar. So he's got quite a few on there. Great listen. If you haven't had a chance to, make sure that you check that out. But I discovered that in 2019. One other podcast that I discovered in 2019, a comedic duo by the name of Government Name Podcast. That's Shogun and Cole Jackson, two funny brothers out of Alabama. Their podcast runs right at about 2 hours, but it's a comedy podcast. They're funny. They talk about pop culture. Real cool dudes, man. I think you'll really enjoy it. Shout out to Cole and Shogun. The next podcast that I discovered in 2014 was a podcast called What the 40. It's by my girl B, and I think B lives in Vegas, and she started this podcast, I guess, coming up on the age of 40. So she speaks and runs this podcast as a woman who is, into her life, into her family, her marriage, kids, grandchildren, that type of thing. So it's a really for the adult contemporary folks like myself, aka old heads. I think you'll enjoy this podcast. She is really cool, and I just found it a couple of months ago, and I really like the podcast a lot. Another one that I just recently came up on, Black Law and Legal Lies, podcast that I've heard a few episodes of. Very funny podcast. I'm really enjoying this. It's hosted by Dan and I can't remember what his co-host's name. Dan and Ann, that's it. And they're out of New Orleans, if I'm not mistaken. And very good podcast. That podcast is about 45 minutes. What the 40 is about, the same, about 45 minutes. Very dope podcast. The title is very apropos. So check it out. That's a really good podcast. I'm listening to that on Apple. What the 40 is on Apple Podcasts as well as Spotify, I think. And another one that I discovered this year in 2019 was a docuseries called Freaknik, a discourse in a Paradise Lost. That podcast, it was about, I think, like 6 or 7 episodes. And that podcast really hit home because it talked about the phenomenon that was Freaknik. And if you're around in the 90s, you know about Freaknik. Hopefully you got a chance to experience Freaknik. But if you didn't, you just missed out, because there's nothing that could ever be duplicated that would be Freaknik again. But that is a really dope podcast. And they break it down, and they interview people who have stories. And I even they had something where they wanted people to call in and leave a voicemail as some of their experiences. And I even contemplated about calling in with my Freaknik experiences, because it was one of those things really with Freaknik. If you didn't go, I could tell you a story. I could tell you several stories, but you had to be there. But they will be back for season 2, I think. And but it was a really dope podcast. I can't remember the host's name, but that was a really good one that I discovered in 2019. One of my favorites from 2019 that I discovered, and I don't even remember how I discovered it. I just started following her on Twitter, or maybe she started following me, and I followed her back, and then we started chatting. Was my girl Autumn the Aries, the Lit Life podcast. I love Autumn's podcast. Autumn drops her podcast every Tuesday/Wednesday. Podcast usually runs anywhere between 40 minutes to an hour. Really dope podcast. She talks about her life, pop culture as well. But it's a really cool podcast. Real easy listen. Autumn is mad cool. I almost got a chance to meet Autumn. We were both ironically at the Freaknik concert this summer, but missed each other. She lives here in Atlanta. She's from Ohio originally, and she's been here for 4 years. Where I live in Atlanta, and but I'm gonna link up with her soon, but and hopefully get her on my podcast as well. But Autumn's really, really dope. Make sure that you check out her podcast, Lit Life Podcast. She has a cat, and her cat from time to time will make an appearance on her podcast, and it is so funny because her cat is so loud. But seriously, it's really dope podcast. One of the best finds I think for 2019 for me. If I'm not mistaken, she just got started in 2019. So when you listen to her podcast, you'll see that she's very, very polished, and she's definitely a force to be reckoned with. I'm really enjoying her podcast on a week-to-week basis. So those are the podcasts that I discovered in 2019. Now, let's take a little bit of time to talk about just some of my regular podcasts that I listen to on a week-to-week basis. These are the ones that these are the heavy hitters, if you will. These are the ones that drop every week, and they're producing great content, just like some of the ones that I discovered in 2019 that I thoroughly enjoy. And of course, they're in no particular order. First up, the Tactless Know-It-Alls podcast. What can I say about Tactless Know-It-Alls? Those are my folk. Ty and Mia, we go back. And they're like, we call ourselves podcast cousins. I mean, like they are really, really cool. We've hung out here in the city of Atlanta. In fact, my wife and I went to their house a couple months ago, and we got into a friendly game of spades. And shall I say, we bust their ass. Oh man, we ate, drank, and played spades, and it was just like some old black people shit. But it was dope, man, and I love having them on the podcast and love being on their podcast. Those are my folk. Again, the Tactless Know-It-Alls podcast drops every Monday. Their podcast is right at an hour. They also have a sister podcast. It's called The Conversation Theory. That's Mia's podcast alone by herself. She'll have co-hosts on from time to time, but Mia's podcast usually runs anywhere between 25 to 30 minutes. She has a dope podcast as well when she's flying solo. And if I'm going to talk about family, of course, I can't forget my Dead End family, the homies Dead End Sports. Many of you listening, you probably came to my podcast from, hearing me on Dead End Sports. Dead End Sports consists of the crew, Kim, B, FIFO, and my boy Nikki Duce, aka Mr. Disrespect. The Dead End Sports podcast drops they changed it. So now it's dropping every Monday. But Sports Conversations is the place where I coined the place where sports opinions collide. And that's exactly what it is. If you want to hear sports from a African-American perspective, a pro-black perspective, definitely check out Dead End Sports. That's my boys. And their sister podcast, Is the Mic Still On? Is the Mic Still On is a dope podcast that comes out every Wednesday. That usually runs about an hour. I probably say about an hour and a half. Dope podcast. Great content week in and week out. So make sure that you check them out as well. And of course, can't forget our brother, my man Manny from Any Given Sunday podcast. Manny drops a podcast I think his podcast comes out every Monday. It's usually anywhere between an hour and a half. Another dope sports podcast from my man Manny Fresh out in the Pacific Northwest. Who else has another one in the rotation? My man Sid Davis from the Social Introvert podcast. Sid drops his podcast every Wednesday and Thursday. He talks about pop culture, TV, and movies. Man, Sid's got a dope podcast. His podcast normally runs anywhere from 35 to 40 minutes long. I kind of marvel at Sid's podcast because Sid is able to knock out 2 podcasts in a week. When you're flying solo, people don't understand, like, that's not easy shit to do. Sometimes it can be difficult just doing 1 podcast a week. So for someone to be able to do a podcast like that and put out good content, I got to shout out the homie Sid Davis, and I appreciate the weekly shout outs as well. Who else? My boys. We Come From Bad News. I just drew a blank just that fast. We Come From Bad News. Man, I love their podcast, man. Inyaze and my boy Al, they drop a podcast. It's weekly. I usually find it or listen every Tuesday or Wednesday. Their podcast is on I'd say probably about anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour. Really, really dope podcast. It's live streamed on Facebook. They've been at it for a minute. Inyaze lives in LA and Al lives here in Atlanta. And they managed to pull it off, man. It's a really, really dope podcast. I think you all will enjoy that as well. Next podcast was one that I found last year, and it just keeps getting better and better. My homegirl, Erica Jones, her podcast is called the E and Friends Podcast. Her podcast is bi-weekly. She talks about pop culture and she talks about women's issues. And a lot of times she'll have her friends on and they'll talk about women's issues. But trust me, fellas, you want to listen, because if nothing else, is going to be funny. When they speak from a woman's perspective, it is really, really enlightening. And I really enjoy listening to her podcast on a bi-weekly basis. Next up, one of my favorites, one of the funniest podcasts that I listen to on a week-to-week basis. It drops every Friday. It's the Almighty Frocast with Queen Germ and King Germ. What can I say about Frocast, man? Frocast is it is really, really funny. Queen Germ and King Germ are married. They've been married for, 16, 17 years. And they sound like an old married couple, but and I say that in high regard because they sound like great friends. And it seems like every week King Germ is backed into a corner. He says something crazy and Queen Germ is on his ass. And it's so funny because they sound like two old people arguing, but it is so beautiful. Like I said, that podcast comes out every Friday. It makes my Friday because most people don't drop podcasts on Fridays. And for them to drop, a Frocast episode each Friday, and I think they're closing in on 400 episodes. So they've been doing this for a long time. And to keep it funky and keep it fresh is very appealing. King Germ, I'll talk about him in just a few minutes, but King Germ has been on my podcast a couple of times this year, and we had a ball. Now, one thing I will say about King Germ is a great, great guy. But King Germ likes North Carolina A&T. Why? I don't know. I don't know why anybody would like North Carolina A&T. If you're familiar with me, you know that I went to South Carolina State. North Carolina A&T is our huge rival. So I don't know why King Germ would like North Carolina A&T. Nonetheless, I let him come on the podcast. Anyway, shout out to Germ. Shout out to Queen Germ. The Frocast is one of the best podcasts out. One of my favorites. More podcast cousins right here. Bibi and Mia. Maya, excuse me. Damn, why I say Mia? Bibi and Maya from the We Did That Shit podcast. Man, these ladies are so dope. I love their podcast. They're on a hiatus right now. But their podcast will come out each Monday, and it usually runs about an hour. If you haven't checked their podcast out, it's on every site. It's on I was gonna say Frocast. I'm sorry. It's on Spotify, Apple, Castbox, whatever you name it. But We Did That Shit podcast is so funny. Again, they're two women who are actually cousins, but they sound like sisters. And they talk about pop culture. They talk about life. They talk about just living life as black women. Love their podcast. They've been on my podcast. And I really enjoyed having them. I am looking forward to the return of the We Did That Shit podcast because they've been on hiatus for a little bit. I understand, sometimes people have things that go on. So, we're not rushing them back. But as a fan and as family, I look forward to their return. Last but not least, man, is a dude that you love, or you might not. My boy Eclectic, the Eclectic Discussion podcast, as well as he also has another podcast called the Encyclopedia Hip Hop Podcast. those podcasts usually last about an hour, hour and a half. Eclectic is very sporadic. If you've heard him on my podcast, if you listen, so he'll drop a podcast, one day, and then like it might be weeks before there's another podcast that's dropped. But always dope content. The Encyclopedia Hip Hop podcast is where he talks hip hop all the time. Normally, I'm a guest on there as well. I've been a guest several times on the Encyclopedia Hip Hop podcast, as well as the Eclectic Discussion podcast. But that's my boy. That's family right there. We get it in all the time. So those are some of the ones that I think, and I don't think I left anybody out, but those are some of the podcasts that I think you got to listen to on a week-to-week basis. When you find those podcasts, please subscribe to them, because trust me, they're worth your while. I don't think that there's anybody that I've named who has a podcast that you could listen to, and then you come back to me a month from now and say, hey, Kyle, I don't like that podcast. They're whack. Trust me, I listen to dope shit. Everybody that I named is dope, and you want to listen to dope podcasts. So you definitely want to check that out. So I tell you what, let's take a quick commercial break. And on the other side of the break, I'll tell you about some of the podcasts that I did this year with some of my friends and what we talked about. Sit tight. We'll be back in just a second.
Mars Blackman here again. Nobody in the world can cover my main man, Michael Jordan. Nobody. Nobody. I'm telling you, it's impossible. Impossible.
However, it's easy to cover Mars Blackman.
And just like that, we are back. Once again, it's your boy 12 Kyle. This is the 12 Kyle podcast. And we're talking about what was in your ears in 2019, the year in review on podcasts. As I mentioned before the break, I had quite a few podcasts where I had contributors come in, friends and family come in and, do podcasts with me. So I wanted to take a second to recognize those people that, blessed the mic on the 12 Kyle podcast. We got the year started with my man Ty from the Tackless Know-It-Alls podcast. We did a podcast called Top 5 Diss Records in Hip Hop History. That was a lot of fun, man. Having Ty on, as I mentioned before the break, we've hung out here. I've been to their house, and it's funny because I remember like one time I went to his house and we might have talked about hip hop for like an hour and a half, and his wife Mia was just sitting over there just chilling. And we are very, very hip, very cool hip hop heads and like-minded individuals. And when I told him, I said, Ty, I want you to come up with a list of your top 5 diss records. I figured that we might have 2 or 3 diss records that were the same. Surprisingly, we only had 1 diss record that was the same that made our top 5. But that was really, really a dope podcast. I thoroughly enjoyed it. And I got to shout my man Ty again for coming on. I also had did another podcast with another friend of mine, my man Matt B. He came through for the 20-year review on the Roots album Things Fall Apart. Matt B. had a good time. He and I had talked about it. We had messaged each other, and we were really excited about doing this podcast. But the Roots album Things Fall Apart turned 20 years old in 2019, and we wanted to discuss it. So we talked about it, broke it down. Really, really dope podcast. If you did not get a chance to check it out, please go back and do so. The aforementioned ladies from We Did That Shit, Maya and Babi. Maya and Babi came on and we talked about the 10 things you must never ignore in a relationship. This podcast was really, really dope, and I really enjoyed it because I have my opinions on things when it comes to relationship. But I mean, people can look and say, oh, hey, okay, well, hey, you're the old married guy. These are 2 young ladies who aren't married and who are, on the dating scene and so forth and so on. And yeah, it was really, really dope. It was great having them on, getting their perspective. And like I said earlier, I really look forward to having them back on because they're family and they offer a different spin on even what I would have thought would be the, woman's perspective. So I really enjoyed having them on. One other podcast that I did was a podcast called Black Motherhood. And I did that with my homegirl, Shantae. Shantae and I go way back. We go back to like 2007, 2008, something like that. Shantae's a mother. She's out of Houston, and she came on to talk about just her role and her experiences as a Black mother. And we dropped that right before Mother's Day. And so that was really, really dope. I enjoyed that podcast. Shantae always has a great perspective on things. Like I said, we've been friends for a minute. She's funny when she wants to be, but I really, really enjoyed that podcast. And I think it really resonated with a lot of people, especially considering the fact that, that it came out right around Mother's Day. What was another one that I did? Oh, can't forget, Matt B came back again later on in the year as a part of the Versus series that I do. We did a podcast called Common versus Nas Discographies. And so what we did was we took a look at the discography, getting tongue tied. Sorry, the discography for Nas and the discography for Common. And I think at the time, both MCs had 11 albums out. So what we did was we did a scoring method and we based it on the Source microphone system. And we came up with numbers to figure out who had the better discography. Now, my numbers suggested that Nas won. His numbers suggested that Common won. If you didn't get a chance to listen to the podcast, do yourself a favor. Go back and listen to that one. You tell us who had the better discography. Another podcast that I did that was really, really dope. My man Cole Jackson from the Government Name Podcast came through. We did a podcast called Yo MTV Raps and Rap City. And what we did was we took a look back at just the impact of those two shows on hip hop. Now, if you're a fan of hip hop, such as I am and such as Cole Jackson is, you will really, really enjoy that podcast. We went back and we took a look at, some of our favorite moments and some of the reasons why those two shows resonated with the young hip hop audience. And really, really enjoyed it, man. Cole was dope on that. And like I said, I'm looking forward to having him back on the podcast as well. My boy King Germ from the aforementioned Almighty Frocast. King Germ came on the podcast. We actually did two podcasts. The first podcast we did was called Left-Handed Cigarettes. Now, left-handed cigarettes is a slang term for marijuana, weed, ganja, reefer. So since I've never tried marijuana and King Germ is a connoisseur of the Kush, we had a great episode, man. So if you didn't get a chance to check that out, please check that one out as well. Also, King Germ came back and we did a podcast called The South Got Something to Say. And on that podcast, we talked hip hop, but we talked about, we did our favorite Southern rappers. And so I was interested to see, who was on his favorite Southern 5 rappers list. And I had my list as well. If you missed that one, please go back and check that one out as well. What else? Oh, my man, can't forget about my boy, Eclectic. Eclectic came through and we talked about, we celebrated the 25th anniversary of Ready to Die by the Notorious B.I.G., aka Biggie Smalls. That one was a really, really dope podcast. Any hip hop heads, you want to definitely check that one out. Of course, he knows his hip hop and he brought a lot to the table as we talked about and took a look at and broke down the Ready to Die album. You might be a little bit surprised at what we thought of it, but it was a really, really great podcast. I definitely have to get E back on here. We got some more albums to talk about. And I got a feeling we're going to talk a little R&B as well. So yeah, it was always good having the homie Eclectic on the podcast. Let's see what else. I think I think I can't think of, yeah. Oh, how can I forget? The homies, my boys D Love Hall and Easy Does It VA, aka my boys Derek and Zell. They came on really for 3 podcasts, 3 different episodes. We started the year off. The first podcast we did was called Jordan, AI, and LeBron. And on that podcast, we talked about Michael Jordan, Allen Iverson, and LeBron James. Talked about their significance to the culture, the games, everything in between. We even got a story. We even got a story from Zell that was downright comical about the time that he had to play Allen Iverson in a pickup game when he was a student at Hampton University. If you haven't heard that podcast, if no other reason, go back and listen to that story. One of the funniest moments on the podcast this year. We talked so long that we actually had to break that podcast up into 2 separate episodes. But you'll enjoy it nonetheless. Then they came back later on this year, and we did a podcast called The Shoe Show, Volume 2. On that podcast, we talked about our experiences with strip clubs. Comical podcast with me and 2 of my childhood friends, just talking about our experiences with strip clubs. Very, very funny podcast. And last but not least, the podcast that we did right before Father's Day was a podcast called Black Fatherhood. And again, that was with D Love Hall and Easy Does It VA, aka Derek and Zell. And honestly, it's hard to say that, of all the podcasts that you do, because each one has a certain special feeling or memory about it. Even the ones that I do solo. But honestly, that was my favorite podcast to do and produce in 2019. We talked about our jobs and our roles as fathers. We took a look back on our journeys through fatherhood. We talked a lot about our fathers. Unfortunately, Zell's father is no longer with us, but one of the great things about this podcast is that when we were done, Derek's father listened to it and my dad listened to it. And the response and feedback that I got from both of them was enough to almost, make a player cry, man, to be honest. It was just that touching. But anytime you could talk to your boys and you talk about fatherhood is really, really dope. And I think one of the things that was interesting was hearing them talk about me and my journey in fatherhood, because I became a father before they did, not much longer before they did, but I did. And just their vision of seeing me develop and grow as a father and as a man. And it's something that you really don't think about, but hearing that from your boys that you grew up with was very, very special. So if you get a chance, go back and check out that podcast as well. All in all, man, 2019, it was a great year for podcasts. 2019, depending on who you ask, was a year that went very quickly. At least for me, it did. Now, some will say that, 2019 wasn't a good year and they struggled or this or that happened. And I understand it. I get it. I mean, in 2019, we took some losses. I will say this much. 2019 for me, while it wasn't it was a good year. It wasn't a great year, but it had to be a great year because I got a chance to see it. And so many people did not get a chance to see it. And I want to take a second to say rest in peace to my little cousin who was murdered in Newark. Rest in peace to my boy, Big Ty, who played football with me at South Carolina State, and my fellow classmate, Tafaraji Allen, who passed away as well. We never know what's going to happen in a year. People start the year off one way. Some people don't finish it. So I think we should all be happy and satisfied, if we saw the year happen and we saw it end. And I think that's what really, really counts. But all in all, I want to thank everybody for listening to this podcast. I don't say it enough, but thank you. You don't have to listen to this podcast. You really don't. I mean, I probably named, 50 podcasts other than mine on this podcast in particular. So there's tons of podcasts that you can listen to. And I'm very, very flattered and honored that you take the time week in and week out to listen to mine. I probably don't say it as much as I should, but I really do appreciate it. And if I hit you up on Twitter and I tell you that I appreciate it, I really do. Because again, I've said this before on this podcast. I sit down in my library, in my house, and I start recording. And I know what I want to talk about, and I know what kind of music I want to play behind it, and I know what I want to do. But once I put it out, and this podcast drops at midnight every Thursday night, once I put it out, I don't know who listens to it. I mean, unless people give me feedback. Of course, I get numbers. It was interesting looking at the numbers from Spotify. Shout out to my girl Amber Stees, who hit me up, and she sent me a screenshot of her top 5 on Spotify, and I was in her top 5. My man Dabney Life on Twitter, he hit me up and sent me his top 5, as well as King Germ. I was in King Germ's top 5. So I don't take that lightly. I'm very, very humbled that you take the time to listen, that you take the time to, as my man King Germ say, fuck with the kid left, sideways, left ways, or no ways at all. It goes a long way, and I really do appreciate it. And I'm honored and flattered sometimes when people who aren't listening are listening. And so I don't put it out to get certain numbers or anything like that. I am really, really humbled by it. And I thank you all for that, because you don't have to listen. I'm glad that one person listens, but outside of that, everything else is gravy. What I can tell you is that 2020 will see me bringing more podcasts. I'll probably have more people on, and we'll probably hit more different topics. It's really just about the feel and the vibe and whatever I want to talk about. So again, from me to you, I want to thank you. I hope that 2020 is filled with prosperity, health, and money, and all in between. That's going to do it for me. Thank you again for checking out the latest edition of the 12 Kyle podcast. I'm your boy 12 Kyle. Catch you guys next year. 5 G's.